Imagine if you and your partner gave birth to a child prematurely, and your child was born incredibly ill, and the doctors at the hospital where your infant is being cared for have no idea what's wrong. And your infant keeps crashing and collapsing, and the doctors seem oblivious and even leave for the night in the middle of one of those crashes. Until finally, the doctor in charge of your infant's care discovers that your infant has a bowel obstruction, one of the most painful things a human can go through, let alone an infant who's just arrived on this planet. And rather than being able to address your child's agony, the child is allowed to lapse and collapse until finally he is removed from life support and placed in your arms. And you hold that infant for 5 hours as he squirms in agony, suffering visibly, sounds coming from his bowels. No one around to help except a kind nurse or two. No doctors approaching you. No suggestions for a plan until finally you're able to track down a doctor who happens to pass by in the hallway near where you're sitting with your infant who is dying in your arms. And you beg the doctor to give your infant morphine so that your infant isn't shuddering and crying and suffering so much. And after much cajoling, that doctor, who is, it turns out, the one who was in charge of your infant's care, finally agrees to give your infant morphine. And it gives slight peace to your infant for a short amount of time, and then the agony begins again. And as you hold the sweet piece of yourself in your arms, you watch as the life drains from his body and he dies in your arms. This happened to child C, one of the infants which Lucy Letby was accused of murdering at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2015. And this is a true story that was shared with me by Nurse Jenny in the comment section of one of my videos. And I thought it was appropriate to start this part of my series on the individuals and institutions involved in the miscarriage of justice that put Lucy Letby in prison for the rest of her life for murders and attempted murders that she did not commit with that story, because it's about the hospital where Lucy worked, the Countess of Chester Hospital. And I'm going to go through all of the many ways in which the Countess of Chester was not fit for purpose, and the ways in which this hospital was responsible for the deaths of the infants that Lucy was then put in prison for, and the ways in which the consultants present on the unit were also responsible, but mostly just the system-wide failures that led to these horrible losses, these tragic events that took the lives of premature infants who may or may not have had a chance to survive, but at the Countess of Chester, they had no chance at all. And then for those who collapsed and did survive and who still suffer to this day from the ineptitude of that hospital, they would have had more of a chance to have a normal life had it not been for the failures of that hospital. Failures that led it to being downgraded during Lucy's persecution. Failures that it was never held accountable for because instead an innocent woman took the fall. So let's just begin with one of the many issues that plagued the Countess of Chester, and that is the sewage in the ceilings that led to the Pseudomonas bacteria. That Pseudomonas was noted in the urgent care risk register, that it was something that was existing on the unit because the tap water was affected by the bacteria that came from the sewage that was backing up both in the sinks, the toilets, and dripping through the pipes in the ceiling. So that was number one. That was a number one issue for the Countess of Chester Hospital. Another major problem on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester was improper intubation. Many doctors didn't quite know how to intubate these tiny babies. They just didn't have the proper training. And an example of that is baby Noah, who had the tube inserted in his esophagus rather than in his trachea. And sadly, he passed. And there were 5 different signs that should have told the doctors present for his passing that his tube had been improperly placed, but they missed all of them. And we lost this beautiful baby because of their ineptitude. This was a common occurrence on that unit and a problem that should have been addressed. There were issues with the machinery on the unit. Not only was there not enough room for the equipment necessary to care for these infants, but one of their blood gas monitors was broken from 2015 to 2016, which incidentally was the year that Lucy Letby was accused of murdering and attempting to murder infants. One of the major issues on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016 was sepsis. Sepsis is an emergency that occurs when the body's response to infection becomes uncontrolled and it starts to attack its own organs. And it's incredibly painful and it is preventable, but it needs to be picked up on. It needs to be recognized. The signs need to be recognized by the doctors present. And at the Countess of Chester, it was a regular issue that the doctors could not recognize the signs of sepsis. And in fact, it was the 5th worst hospital in the NHS for recognizing signs of sepsis. Jacob Evans was an infant, one of the first infants who is noted as having sepsis, at least as far as I can see in terms of this case. And fortunately, he survived. But it's just an example of how in 2015, sepsis was an issue and yet was never allowed to be a part of the court case at all. So here are some ways in which sepsis played a role in the Countess of Chester and in the deaths of the infants that Lucy Letby was accused of murdering. Lucy was accused of murdering babies A, C, and D, and baby B collapsed. And it was suspected that every single one of them had sepsis. Carolyn Oakley, who was a nurse on the unit at the time, said that child D definitely had sepsis. It definitely played a role in child D's death. Lucy knew that child D had sepsis and even mentioned it in a text that she sent to a friend after the child passed. Stephen Breary himself, who was the cause of this entire disaster, the number one witch hunter, said himself that child D had signs of sepsis starting at 12 minutes of age, and that child D had prolonged rupture of membranes, meaning that the amniotic sac that the child was in while the mother was pregnant with him ruptured, which exposes the child to infection, which then leads to sepsis. He said it himself, but then in that same email that he sent to colleagues about child D having sepsis, he also mentioned that there was one nurse present for this child's collapse. Interesting that he started it that early at a senior clinicians meeting in June of 2015 as well. There was a note made that the treatment of sepsis using antibiotics needed to be standardized between the children's unit and the neonatal unit because of this major issue that they were facing. A note about the delay in recognizing sepsis in child D in time was made in the NHS England Strategic Executive Information System. So even though Breary said in his email after the fact that child D had sepsis, it was not recognized soon enough to save the infant. And this was noted. Yvonne Griffiths, who was the NNU manager at the time, was interviewed by the Ficiri Milios, and she agreed with Kay Boyle, who was the interviewer, that Not only had Breary pointed out that there was a commonality between Lucy and the recent deaths on the unit, but at the same time, he suggested that the infants were unstable and had neonatal sepsis. So even while he was acknowledging that there was sepsis in these infants, he was trying to push the narrative toward Lucy. Interesting. John Gibbs, the doctor who was responsible for the infant at the beginning of this video, who died from bowel obstruction, recorded that during ward rounds, baby F was recovering from respiratory distress syndrome and was being treated for suspected sepsis and had lost 10% of its weight since birth and decreased circulation, which led to his eventual collapse. And John Gibbs was another one of the driving forces behind Lucy Letby's persecution and eventual conviction. But he too acknowledged that sepsis was an issue on the unit. In June of 2016, which was right at the height of Breary's attack on Lucy Letby, right when he was just positive she was a murderer and had convinced most of his fellow consultants on the unit that she was a murderer, still sent an email suggesting that the unit get a deep clean and that cots were removed to create space between them so that infection didn't spread. So, which is it? Is there murder or is there poor care? The latter, I think we all know to be true. But even then, he was sending emails about infection. And then again, in November of 2016, after Lucy had been removed from the unit, after everything transpired and the witch hunt was in full progress, there was an email between Stephen Breary and Ian Harvey and Sue Erdley about sepsis on the ward. So there has always been acknowledgement of sepsis being an issue on that unit. And yet it was not ever discussed in the court case and never considered a part of what took these infants' lives. As I've heard from people who know what they're talking about, like doctors and medical professionals, you can rarely discover one cause of death for a neonatal infant. There are usually many causes that coalesce, and sepsis is often one of them. And that was the case on this unit. It was not murder. It was not attempted murder. Another major issue at the Countess of Chester Hospital on the neonatal ward was understaffing, a problem across the board for all hospitals around the world, but the Countess of Chester was no different. Major staffing issues. And even as early as March 2015, Arian Powell said that the risks for patient safety were very high because of understaffing. She noted it in the hospital's internal register. Arian Powell also noted that during one of the infant's deaths, there was no consultant, no senior doctor present overnight when that infant died, that only junior doctors were present. And she was noting this for a number of reasons. Number one, to point out that the doctors were not doing more rounds than 2 a week for very ill babies who should have been seeing doctors every day. And also probably to note that they just didn't have enough skilled doctors to do rounds as much as they should. In December of 2015, right in the middle of Lucy's time on the ward where she was being accused of attacking infants, The Guardian noted that the Countess of Chester staff was chronically overworked and stretched thinner and thinner. That's a quote. Tony Chambers, who was the executive of the hospital at the time, said that the shortage of doctors and trained nurses was the reason for that chronically overworked situation. And Allison Timmis, who was a consultant on the ward, said to The Guardian, and I'm going to read the quote here, "Over the past few weeks, I've seen several medical and nursing colleagues in tears. They get upset as they know the care they're providing falls below their high standards. When things snap, the casualties will either be children's lives or the mental and physical health of the staff." She said that the unit was not safe and that no one was listening. Also, that month, December of 2015, it was noted that the Countess of Chester was failing to meet the British Association of Perinatal Standards by remaining open because they had 74.3% of their nurses trained as registered nurses, and the rest, 25.7, were not registered nurses. And that goes below the standards of the British Association of Perinatal Standards. The Countess of Chester was listed as the lowest proportion of registered nurses in the Northwest Operational Delivery Network, and that patient safety was compromised. The Care Quality Commission, the CQC, noted reliance on agency staff, particularly at night. Agency staff meaning they weren't full-time employees, they were called in on a daily basis, weekly basis. I'm not quite sure how that works, but there was a reliance on that. So they lacked skilled nurses and were calling in part-time nurses who weren't necessarily as experienced as nurses who would be working full-time at the hospital. This was particularly at night, the CQC said, which is the worst time for any patient. It's much more likely that there will be deaths at night than during the day. And at night is when they were calling in agency nurses. The CQC also cited short staffing and understaffing as the most common factor in avoidable deaths on the unit. In June of 2016, which was the very month that Dr. John Gibbs really jumped on board with the Lucy Letby as a murderer narrative. And it's interesting because it coincided, as I said in my last video, with the death of two twins in a set of triplets that he was responsible for caring for and that his mistakes led to the deaths of. But anyway, in June of 2016, Arian Powell and Stephen Breary discussed increasing advanced neonatal practitioners, specialist trained neonatal nurses on the ward, even though, again, in 2008, they had made ANNPs redundant because of funding issues. But they were talking about increasing that and also pursuing training for current nurses to become ANNPs on the unit. But then, interestingly, 2 weeks later, Breary was at a board meeting for the hospital and said that he couldn't see how changes in staffing or acuity could account for the increased mortality because he was trying to spread his narrative. So by admitting that they didn't have trained nurses on the unit and that they were short-staffed, that would take the pressure off of Lucy, and he certainly didn't want that. So it's interesting that in private, he was acknowledging that they needed more trained nurses, but when he had the ear of the board, he wouldn't admit that because he wanted his story to take hold, and it did. The RCPCH also noted that the understaffed unit was severely in need of more staff, more training, that was the main cause, one of the main causes of the disaster that the unit had become. Another problem at the Countess of Chester neonatal ward was the issue of transfers, of sending very sick babies to level 3 units that could care for them. There were a lot of issues with that, both logistic and decision-based. An example of this was child I, who sadly passed away in October of 2015. And after child I passed, Stephen Breary stated in an email that she died after 5 transfers between the Countess of Chester, Liverpool Women's Hospital, and Arrow Park Hospital, and that the transfers didn't help in her survival. In other words, too many transfers probably led to her death, which could have been avoided if only it hadn't happened as much. Maybe not, but he suggested that. And he said that a review should take place. And this was a problem generally. It was a matter of actually being able to get a transfer unit to arrive at the hospital in time and get it done quickly. It was a matter of distance between the hospitals. And it was also a matter of the doctors actually making the decision to set up the transfer, decide that they can't handle this baby and that more skilled unit needed to handle them. And that, to me, points to ego. They didn't want to admit they'd fail. I can't see John Gibbs admitting that he was going to fail child C with the bowel obstruction that eventually took that child's life. He decided he was going to keep the baby so that he could build his own ego rather than transfer the baby where the baby belonged. They just didn't want to decide that they couldn't handle the baby. They didn't want to take that prick to their ego. And the nurses reported that the escalation of these cases was a major problem, but that they didn't feel empowered to be able to step in and push for that escalation, and that it depended upon the consultant with whom they were working on whether they felt empowered to do that. So if you think about a bully like Stephen Breary working on the unit, they didn't feel comfortable pushing back against him, and he would refuse to transfer infants because his ego wouldn't let him. Or John Gibbs, same thing. They just didn't feel safe or comfortable or like they had the right to advocate for the baby because the doctors always knew best, that old-fashioned mentality. And so that did damage and in some cases took the lives of these infants that were in their care. The RCPCH noted that transfers were an enormous problem at the hospital and that there was inadequate communication between the clinicians and the transfer team. In other words, contacting them, letting them know the situation, doing so in time, doing so that the transfer team had a chance to get there in time, all of those kinds of things, major problem, and confusion about the protocol behind the decision to escalate a baby to a transfer to a tertiary unit, a unit that could handle the child. So, very important aspect of care, getting the patient to the correct unit, and a failure on many counts on the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Another major aspect that was impeding the care of the infants on that ward was the relationships between the teams on the ward. There was a level of cruelty and gossip and nastiness and immaturity that existed on the ward that got in the way of their ability to perform their jobs. And I really don't need to say anything else because what I'm talking about right now is the conviction of an innocent woman for murders and attempted murders she didn't commit. And that was all because of meanness and gossip and spreading stories and protecting oneself by pointing the finger at another. So that's meanness. But let's just go into a couple more incidents that show that on the unit generally outside of Lucy. First, if you consider what Lucy's friend has said, Lucy's friend who has spoken out for Lucy on numerous occasions and did so in the Netflix documentary, where she said that when they were student nurses working at the Countess of Chester on the neonatal unit, it was just a really gossipy, kind of nasty place to work. And that the full-time staff there, the doctors, all the, the nurses, they were cold and kind of didn't accept them into their circle. And Lucy's friend even wondered why Lucy would want to work there after they were done with their internship. So Lucy did, but her friend didn't understand why she'd want to be around those people. Veronica Juraskova, who was a GP trainee on the unit for a year, I think from 2015 to 2016, said that the doctors and nurses and all the teams on that unit did not work in a cohesive way, that some doctors disliked one another, talked about one another behind one another's backs, gossiped, looked down on the trainees, treated them as less than, and doubts, she says, that Lucy Letby is guilty of what she has been convicted for based on what she saw on that unit. And also just the incident that I discussed before about nurses not feeling like they were empowered to escalate infants to tertiary wards because of the consultants. They were made to feel like they weren't important enough, good enough, that they didn't know enough to be able to step in and advocate in that way. And that is an example of the immaturity on that unit and the unpleasantness of behavior that existed and that got in the way of care. The RCPCH also noted that there was a problem with communication and relationships between teams, that the doctors and nurses as teams didn't get along, that communication was generally bad, and that there was low morale, that generally there was low morale. And I can see how that would be the case considering how poorly the unit was doing, but it wasn't helping that the head of the unit, Stephen Breary, was accusing a woman of murder for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and creating fear amongst the staff and particularly the nurses. And an example of that was once Ravi Jairam, the puppet, got involved, he started saying out loud that he believed somebody was responsible for the murders on the unit. And a nurse who worked on the unit overheard him saying that and went to Arian Powell and said she was afraid to return to work because she didn't want to be the next one fingered like Lucy Letby was. So that's immaturity and nastiness at its worst. There was a particular locum doctor who was a problem and had worked on the unit before, and the nurses went to management and said, please don't bring this doctor back. He's dangerous. He's not good at his job. And I don't really know the details. Nobody does about really why they didn't want him there, but they were very insistent, but hospital management didn't listen. He was allowed to return. You can imagine how pleasant and fun that was. So there's another example of the ways in which it was just an unpleasant unit personally to work on. Arian Powell, while she was dealing with the debate with Stephen Breary about whether Lucy Letby was a murderer or not, Stephen Breary insisting she was, and Arian Powell insisting it's just not, there's no evidence of it, not agreeing and thinking she was innocent. At one point, they were in a meeting, and Stephen Breary had some kind of outburst and insisted that Lucy Letby was a murderer and insisted that Arian Powell sign a letter on the spot. They're at a meeting, it's in the evening, and I don't know what the letter said. She never clarified, as far as I know, what the letter said, but I imagine it was something like, I take responsibility for my decision to keep Lucy Letby on the unit, or something like that, because that seemed to be his favorite thing to do. And she refused to sign it. And then Jim McCormack, another doctor who jumped on the bandwagon, stood up and said, "You are harboring a murderer." And this is all in a meeting that had nothing to do with Lucy Letby. So this is the kind of behavior we're talking about from adults here. It's a problem, and it got in the way of care. They were more focused on Lucy Letby being a murderer than on improving their skills and actually being doctors and being present on the unit. And this just leads me to the RCPCH findings, the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, which we've already gone through, but I thought I would just list a few of the problems on the unit. There was the incidence of Pseudomonas and sepsis. There was not enough consultant presence, bad communication and relationships, the size and the age of the ward, poor visibility, too much moving of infants, which is dangerous for them because they're vulnerable and it exposes them to infection and damage to their tiny bodies, understaffing, low morale, that there was no single cause identified for the increased mortality rate, which is what this review is about, poor documentation of all of the incidents, no training in documentation, and then the major suggestion after the fact was that the unit be downgraded, be redesignated from a level 2 unit to a level 1 unit. So that's just a kind of brief and as concise as possible description of a hospital that was on the edge of collapse. And still probably is, I don't know. And a place that was lucky to have a nurse like Lucy, who was really good at her job and passionate about her job. And yet, it doesn't matter how good you are at your work, you're only as fast as your slowest member. And her slowest member was slow. It was a disaster. It wasn't possible to give good care in these in this unit. And rather than holding the hospital and the doctors responsible for their part in the deaths of these babies in whatever way is necessary. I don't know if it needs to be a conviction and a life sentence for all of them, but having a real review where the problems are acknowledged and dealt with. And if they can't be financially, then the hospital, or at least the unit, is shut down. That should have been the outcome of this entire event instead of the persecution of an innocent woman. And yet, even though some members of the management staff at the hospital did their best to protect Lucy Letby from what happened, in the end, they failed. In the end, nobody wanted to take responsibility for what was really going on. There was a lot of talk, and a lot of people tried as best they could to name the issues, but nobody actually stepped forward and became the whistleblower that somebody needed to be. Lucy Letby was the closest that anybody came to that. She tried, and that's what got her in trouble. She tried to help fix the unit, to note the problems on the unit, and it put her in jail. And it should have been hospital management that stepped forward. I know that's an easy thing to say. I don't know about running hospitals. And I know that the NHS is very strained financially, and I'm going to do another video next about the NHS and the history and problems with the NHS. And I'll also note the problems in the US medical system as well, just to say. But Lucy Letby shouldn't have been the one responsible for healing the problems on that unit. It should have been hospital management and the head of the neonatal unit, Stephen Breary, who, instead of doing that, focused on destroying a young woman's life. And hopefully she will be exonerated. She will find fulfillment in her life that is equal to the fulfillment she felt in nursing until all of this fell upon her. And in turn, he and the others who committed this horrendous act against her will have to answer for what they did. And hopefully the hospital too will be forced to reckon with its role in this nightmare.